and welcome to this episode of the Maryland Risk Management Education Podcast. My name is Paul Geringer, and I'm the Extension Legal Specialist here in the Department of Ag and Resource Economics. And as I pointed out on our podcast episode that came out on Monday, I've been trying to put out some of these based on some issues that have developed based around COVID-19 that are timely and kind of give you a sense of some of the programs or some of the marketing decisions or other issues that may be existing because of the global pandemic. So today I got a guest on today to talk about some of the SBA programs that exist out there. And I'm going to turn it over to the guest here in a second, and then I'll put the contact info in at the end again. So thank you, and I'll hand it over to the pre-recorded episode earlier this week.
Okay, so Adam, how about you introduce yourself and tell us what you do and where you're located at?
You bet. I am a Extension Associate Professor of Agribusiness. I am an ag economist with Clemson University. I have a 100% extension appointment, and I specialize in farm financial analysis, farm succession and estate planning, some ag labor policy issues, Affordable Care Act, and farm stress mental health, and a few other things along those farm management, agribusiness topics.
And you've kind of become an expert in sort of resources now available through the government to help producers and other individuals.
I have been one pandemic. Of the individuals. Yes, not because of desire as much as out of necessity to make sure that our farmers and agribusinesses here in the state are well aware of the ins and outs of some of these programs that have come about over the last 4 or 5 weeks. Yes.
Yeah, I think we've all become experts through necessity on this, and I felt like it would be boring if I just talked about these by myself, and it would be much easier to have somebody come on and kind of talk about them and make it slightly more entertaining. So
it's much more enjoyable having somebody else to converse with instead of just spewing information, isn't it?
It always is. There's at least somebody that you can interact with and at least show emotion at some point. You don't feel like you're talking to an empty room. So
I understand.
So we've had a number of acts come out from Congress, like you said, over the past 6 months. I guess we had Families First Act, the CARES Act, which I can't remember what CARES stands for. And then we had one last week that kind of gave more money to some of the programs that were created. So what are these programs that are existing now that farmers could think about participating in, especially if they're going through some of the various issues that we're experiencing through the pandemic?
Yeah, you're correct. We're on number 4 of the acts right now. The first one was the Preparedness Response Supplemental Appropriations Act, which was for provided money for treatment and prevention, and there was some subsidies for small business loans and some SBA emergency loans. And then was the Families First Response Act, Coronavirus Response Act, which really made businesses have to pay sick leave and those types of things for individuals that were affected by COVID. And then we had the Coronavirus Aid, Relief, and Economic Security Act, or the CARES Act. And that is that was the big $2 trillion stimulus. And that threw money to 2 programs through the SBA. One is the Paycheck Protection Program, which was the most immediate, especially as it related for agriculture. And the other one was the EIDL, or the Emergency Injury Disaster Loan. And so those are the 2 big ones. And of course, they ran out of money relatively quickly, and this 4th Act threw more money into that. And the EIDL at first, even though the intent of Congress was to make that available to all of ag, it never made it into the legislation. And originally within SBA's, what they call their SOPs, or standards of procedures, only had a couple of carve-outs for certain sectors within the ag community, like greenhouses, that were actually eligible for it. And so through the first round, the majority of farms were ineligible for EIDL. They were only eligible for the PPP. Now, also because of the CARES Act, there was significant funding that was pushed through to the USDA, and the USDA is now just presently starting to move towards getting some of that set up for additional aid for farms. There's about $9.5 billion that was sent to the USDA Secretary of Ag, $14 billion to the Commodity Credit Corporation, along with a slew of other things. And so, but those are going to be the two big numbers that are going to be utilized for ag. And we do have a little bit of information on how that is going to be set up. We just don't know the details. And of course, as you well know, with your background, the devil is always in the details.
Yep, and I keep waiting on those details to be announced any day for those programs, because I have a feeling there's a number of dairy farmers and a lot of other livestock producers that are going to be looking to see how that money's going to be distributed and what they need to be doing to get into that pool.
Exactly right. That is exactly right. It's horrible. And all we really know right now is the USDA is going to be making some purchases of some of the fresh products, $100 million a month of dairy, $100 million of meat products, $100 million of fresh fruit and veggies, and that's going to get sent, I guess, to distribution sites or some other locale. That's going to get boxed. Those boxes are going to then get sent to organizations and groups that provide for those in need. And so that's a part of the program. And then the other part of the program is going to be direct payments. And the only thing we know right now is about $16 billion is going to be used for that. About 9.6 of it going to livestock producers. And they've got it kind of marked down: 5.1 to cattle, 2.9 to dairy, 1.6 to hogs, 3.9 billion for row crop producers, 2.1 to specialty crop, and $500 million for other crops. And of course, when you really figure that out, that is an absolute drop in the bucket for what might really be needed for most of our producers.
Yeah,
go ahead.
I was going to say, dairy's already said that, I forget how much they lose a day in that, whatever number you just quoted. I think it was around 9.
Oh, yeah, 2.9 billion for dairy is absolutely nothing.
Yeah, it's not even going to cure some of the problems with that. I've seen what the cattle losses are, and at least are what have been estimated, and that's not even close to what those losses are. We don't even know what the pork losses are yet. I haven't seen estimates on that, and I don't even think poultry is eligible for those programs. So,
well, not if we follow normal definitions. It seems like poultry is always separated out from livestock as it relates to USDA and FSA and things like that. Even though most of us, from a production standpoint, it's a livestock, but they seem to be separated out. So, the only other things we know is that a farmer is going to have to show that they've experienced a 5% decrease in a particular crop for that crop that they raised to be eligible. And that decrease has to take place between January and April of 2020. And then there's a whole bunch of other limits and equations that are used to determine what the actual direct payment's going to be. Secretary was expecting sign up early May, with checks going out by late May, early June. And, at least as of late last week, the FSA offices, to my understanding, still didn't know any of the details yet. So
that's my understanding as well. So talking about the acts, the stuff they can at least sign up for, consider now. And I should point out, we're recording this on Tuesday, the 28th, with hopefully it going out on later this week. There is still money in these programs.
As of today, yes. So the PPP and the EIDL was refilled. Those pots were refilled. SBA opened up processing at 10:30 yesterday, Monday, the 27th.
And how soon did the website fail?
Well, right. And so the issues immediately began to be heard of as soon as that happened. There's a lot of questions on how long is that going to last? Is it going to last until Friday? Some estimates were it was going to be gone by within 72 hours because, um, you know, we were hearing some huge numbers of loan applications that were still in the pipeline when they ran out of money previously.
Yeah.
And it may not take but 72 hours to a week and be out of this next round of money. So it's going to be real interesting to see what has happened. And I know many individuals during the week downtime or 10-day downtime, whatever it was, guys were, farmers and businesses were doing what they can, working with their lender to try to get everything in order and get things uploaded into the system so that they would get in line for this next round.
Yeah. So with the payroll protection program, if farmers are thinking about that, what do they need to think about before taking that out, that loan / grant out before they do it?
Yeah, so there's a number of things that we have to be aware of, and everybody wants to jump in because there is a potential that it can be forgiven. And unlike normal, when a loan gets forgiven, that's usually a taxable event. If this gets forgiven, it's not going to be taxable. And so at least that's our understanding of it right now. And so that's a huge positive. However, I would strongly encourage farms and others to really look at this from a standpoint. You're taking out a short-term, 2-year, low interest rate loan. And ever since the legislation, the CARES Act came out, there have been additional guidance and rules coming out, what seems like almost every 72 hours.
Yes.
And if you go straight back to the legislation to read things, right now, things may be very different than what that legislation wrote, which is for many of us is very odd because agencies really can't change legislation, but that's really what we see taking place here, right?
Yes.
And so in the legislation, the PPP loan has a term. However, I think what the agency is able to do, and I can't remember, I didn't memorize it, it says that the term for the PPP loan, the Paycheck Protection Program, would be no more than a 10-year term. Well, within one set of rules that have come out, which is what is being abided by right now, it even stipulates that with consent and through conversation or communication with the secretary, the commissioner has, they have made the determination that the term, given the situation, will not be more than 2 years. And so effectively you're getting a 2-year loan. Originally, the legislation had interest rate not to exceed 4%, and through the rules, as they stand right now, it is an interest rate of 1%. However, we have seen actually some loans running through at 0.5%. So it's not bad, but you need to go in thinking about that because the PPP loan is very constrained, or there are some very specific constraints you have to be aware of if I'm going to make use of it. And especially if I want to apply for forgiveness of the loan. And so the maximum loan amount is going to be the lesser of either $10 million or 250% of the average monthly payroll for 2019. That being said, it's not quite as easy to figure that out because there's a whole bunch of other situations and variables that come into play. Such as, like most farms, you might have many farms that don't have any employees. So does that mean that farm can get $10 million? No, they're going to be considered a self-employed individual. And so for a self-employed individual, rules that came out as of last Tuesday or Wednesday was pretty specific on how that gets dealt with. And if it's a partnership, how it gets dealt with. And so what ends up happening part of the rules has made the determination that if you have an employee and you're trying to determine payroll, and we see this more along the lines of most normal businesses, if they have any employees that make over $100,000, anything above $100,000 does not count in the equation to determine your maximum loan value. And so what ends up happening is if you're self-employed, for those that are not farms, you would take a look at line 31 on your Schedule C and take a look at what that number is. And if it's over $100,000, you essentially cut out anything above 100, and that number is now 100,000. And now what you have to do is divide that number by 12 and multiply that by 2.5, and that is going to be your potential maximum loan value, right? So, so we have those types of issues that come in, and then there's also rules on saying, well, that being said, we're also going to limit on what you can provide back to yourself as a self-employed farmer. And I should say, if I am farming, I don't file a Schedule C on with my 1040. What I file is typically a 1040F. Mm-hmm. And so the equivalent line to that Schedule C line 31 is line 34 on my 1040F. So that's where I'm going to look for. And the reality is, if that is 0 or below, you are ineligible for the PPP loan. So that is going to be one of those things, whether it's I'm using my Schedule C, line 31, or line 34 on my 1040F. If that's at 0, you're ineligible, and everything is going to be based off of that number. Yeah. So, and so we have to be aware of that. And then on top of that, the rules have stated we're going to limit on what you can provide back to yourself for what they're calling an 8-week coverage period of what this loan has to be used for. And so from the day you receive money from that loan, you've got 8 weeks to spend it on some very specific things. And you cannot spend it outside of these approved items. One of them is payroll or self-employed owner compensation. And what you then have to do is take that line, divide that line, no more than $100,000 max, divide it by 52 weeks, multiply it by 8 weeks, and that's what you're going to max out at what you can provide to yourself. And if I want this to be forgiven, the way the rules are written right now, and there's some ambiguity in it, and so we're still waiting for some additional clarification. Surprise, 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 as I think Goober used to say, is that you have to have 75% of the forgivable of the loan, if to be forgiven, spent on payroll / self-employed owner compensation, and no more than 25% of the expenditures for those other approved items. And so those other approved items are going to be things like utilities for that 2-week period of time, but you had to have already had those utilities by mid-February, February 15th. You can pay for 8 weeks of the value of rent or lease, as long as that rent or lease agreement was already in place prior to February 15th. And that becomes a little bit of an issue, because there are some states that have state laws as it relates to farmland rental agreements if there is nothing written, which is pretty typical amongst the farming community, right?
Yes.
And so some of those leases, for like one state in particular I have in my mind out west, I think out west or up in the upper Midwest, is actually those leases don't kick in until March. And so they weren't already technically in play prior to the February 15th. So that, as well as you can use it for the interest on mortgages or mortgage debts. And based on some of the rules, what we believe is that can be used on any loans that I already had prior to February 15th. And I can pay the interest portion for that 8 weeks based on any loans that I have for property or personal property, which would include machinery, equipment, et cetera, like that. So, but that brings in a question, can I pay interest on my operating debt? Well, as the way it's written right now, we don't believe so. So those are some of the intricacies with regards to the payroll protection program. So it is relatively constrained on, it's got constraints on what you could really spend it on. And there's a few little oddities. It says you can eat, we're going to consider fuel for your car that you use for work as a utility. So we have those types of things that are in there. So
And then
you need to really work with your lender and try to find some of those individuals that know the ins and outs of this. The other kicker is, as we saw, including on farms, some farms had to reduce wages because of everything going on, or had to lay people off. And if I laid people off during a couple of different periods because of this COVID piece, and really in general, because it's going to be hard to prove otherwise, you have to eliminate those wage reductions and that reduction in force by June 30th to be able to be eligible for the maximum amount of forgiveness. And if you have not eliminated those, there will be a reduction in what could be forgiven.
yeah, so these programs are beneficial, but yeah, you're pointing out the main thing that I kind of wanted people to get from this is they're complicated, and if you want the loan forgiveness part, there are a lot of hoops you have to jump through.
Exactly. And
make sure you get
we
it.
don't exactly, and we don't know the process right now on asking for forgiveness.
No, and you're not joking. When the rules change, you get updated guidance like every couple of days. SBA and IRS have new stuff posted.
Exactly. And I've had to be careful because everything seems to be coming out from the Department of Treasury flowing through into the SBA, and the SBA is talking with the Secretary of the Treasury in developing these things. But we've also seen that because of some of the rules that are coming out in these CFRs or through FAQs through SBA or through Department of Treasury, it's creating sometimes more confusion than it's actually answering. So when we got that thing a week and a half ago that stated, all right, for self-employed, you need to use line 31 of your Schedule C. Well, then all of a sudden banks stopped processing loans for farmers because farmers don't use Schedule C. And so they said, well, you're no longer eligible, which was not the case.
Yeah.
And it was really an example. I mean, IRS is going to throw out information based on majority, and 1040Fs is a absolute minuscule amount of the returns they get. And so, based on other information that we have, things in totality and other codes, it's pretty easy to infer that was not their intent. You need to find what is the equivalent to line 31 on Schedule C. And so we've got those types of issues taking place. And we've got an issue now also with regards to what if I'm farming and the bulk of my labor is H-2A? Can I use H-2A workers as part of payroll? Because there's a line within the legislation that talks about residency. They have to reside in the U.S. Well, how do you deal with H-2A? Because these are H-2A, these workers come in for a period. They're living here in the U.S., typically on the farm, but not necessarily, but typically on the farm. And they are earning a U.S. dollar while on U.S. soil. And for some farms, they might be here for 10 months. So are they residing in the U.S.? They are legal, non-resident aliens. However, within IRC or IRS tax code, based on some equations, they will be treated like a U.S. citizen with the forms that they have to fill out at certain periods. And so are they or are they not? And there's disagreements by some lenders on what to do. SBA has taken a step back. However, April 24th, there was some additional FAQs that came out late in the day by the Department of Treasury, and they referenced what definition, because we kept asking, well, what definition are y'all going to use? And what was really odd was they actually referenced a particular code that talks about residency as it relates to housing. And so the examples that are used in there are things such as, well, I've got a house in Maine and one in Florida, and this person lives in Florida, in this year and this year, and then lives in this one for this, for the full year here. And so here's how you figure out residency. Doesn't really give specific examples as it relates to this particular situation. However, there is one piece within there that I think could easily be arguable to say, yeah, I'm going to count H-2A workers because they're going to be here for, especially if they're here for contracts of 6 months plus a day. This is where they're here. They're going to church locally. And they're earning the US dollar because it specifically talks about employment, where their employment is. Family might be in another location, but that's just one criteria. And typically, and you'll understand this, the problem is most times when we talk about, somebody asks me a question, there's a lot of ambiguity in many different pieces of policy, law, regulation, and it really stems from facts and circumstances. I could check all the little boxes as described within a piece of code and still have the agency say, sorry, still doesn't apply because of all the rest of the facts and circumstances around it.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And we're putting programs together on the fly, basically, and we're not going to have, the agency isn't going to have answers for random fact patterns that they never thought about at the very start.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. And what's funny is some of these other programs that come out are interplaying with each other after the fact. And so if I'm a farm and I've got somebody that got diagnosed with COVID, and now because of the Families First Act, I have to pay them for 2 weeks of sick time, even though I never offered paid sick time in the past. And I have to pay them at full rate up to a certain dollar value max, daily value, and max per person value, right? If I'm under 500 employees. And to help cover that cost, I can, there's a couple of different ways I could do that. In essence, the feds are paying for it, but really what it is, it's an advance on a refundable tax credit. But the problem is that begins to interplay with some other things that come out through the PPP as it relates to forgiveness. And so if I've made use of those things through the Family First Act to be able to cover sick time or family time as I'm required to do, then my forgiveness portion may be decreased. And so that's another layer of complexity.
Yeah. So,
and we haven't even talked about idle yet.
I was about to get to idle. I was about to say, so what do you have? What are your thoughts? Because idle's, I mean, it's new, but it's just got opened up for farmers. So it was open for some ag businesses, but not all ag businesses. You had to fall in that limited class to actually qualify.
Exactly.
So any thoughts on that for what you've seen in the 2 days?
Yeah, and we have to be real careful with this. And most of the farms I've talked to is going, listen, you got to do the numbers. And in some ways, this whole thing is going to potentially be more of a headache because now we have potential interplay between idle and PPP. And which one am I getting first? And really, if I'm going after both of them, they're two different types of things, and you really want to make sure that I'm not going to use the funding for the same things, even though that I might have gotten one and it's not enough to cover those costs just for tracking purposes. And as what I'll call my CYA, cover your rear end, I want to try to keep everything separate. And so we've been recommending open up a checkbook, a brand new checking account and checkbook for each of these programs if I'm receiving funds from both of them. If I'm receiving funds from just one of them, you open up a new checkbook just for that one, because it's going to help with record keeping. And I may have to provide this information to my lender and or straight to the SBA. PPP, I can go through, usually there's going to be a local lender in your area. There are some rural parts of the country with some of the smaller banks, and they are not going to go through the process to be able to provide loans through the SBA. And so it might be a little bit more difficult for some of those individuals to access the PPP. The SBA, but you can go through online portal on your own through SBA for these loans if you want to go through your local lender. EIDL, you have to go through SBA. You cannot go through a local lender on it. So that's one difference right there. And so again, you want to use these funds from these two different programs for different purposes on the farm. EIDL does not have the same constraints as PPP does, but does have some limitations as well, okay? One of the things that folks like about the EIDL loan is you can receive up to, as soon as I apply for EIDL, up to a $10,000 advance on that potential loan value you're applying for, and that $10,000 acts up to $10,000 acts like a grant, and you're supposed to get that supposedly within 3 days. And so even if the EIDL loan itself gets turned down, I've still gotten this advance that I can still use, and it doesn't have to be repaid. Okay. And so that being said, if I receive the EIDL loan and I use that EIDL loan for payroll, and then I get the PPP, in essence, I have to use the PPP loan to restructure my EIDL loan, all right, or to essentially pay off that debt. And so what I'm doing also is making a couple of changes. One, EIDL has a potential term of up to 30 years, and the interest rate's about 3.75. And so if I'm getting the PPP second after the EIDL, and I use the EIDL for my payroll, and now I have to restructure that portion for my PPP, really what I'm doing is I'm changing from a longer term with higher interest rate to a shorter term with a lower interest rate. So that's something we have to be cognizant of. And depending on the situation, a farmer has to think about, you have to go in and making the assumption, I'm not going to get forgiveness. And I think that puts you in a better position on the use of these funds. Yes, it's good to be optimistic and hope that I'm going to get forgiveness on it, but what happens if it doesn't happen? And so do I have the cash flow to be able to hold on to this and be able to pay it for within this 2-year period of time? The other thing is, in theory, although it says the term is for up to 30 years, it's going to be an SBA loan officer, for lack of a better term, that's going to make the decision based on your capacity and capabilities of business. Although it says the term can be up to 30 years, they may take a look at all your information as a farm and say, no, 5 years is what you've got. That's it. And so you got to understand that as well. Okay. You can use it to cover the cost of things like employee sick leave, payroll, increased material costs, rents, mortgages, other obligations. And so it opens it up a little bit more so than what you have with the PPP. However, you cannot use it for like business expansions and those types of things. The other thing to know about EIDL is loans that are under $25,000 requires no security, no collateral at all. Okay. Things begin to change when I go above $25,000 for the EIDL loan. And for PPP, there's no security or collateral required as well. Loans of $200,000 or more does have to have a personal guarantee for EIDL. All right. The CARES Act waives the personal guarantee requirement for loans less than $200,000. So we're pretty good underneath 200 grand for most folks. When I start getting up above that, you're going to have to personally guarantee that loan. So again, I can use EIDL for employee sick leave, payroll, accounts payable, That's a big one. Operating expenses and material costs, rent, fixed debts, that's the interest on, not principal or prepayments, and other obligations. I cannot use idle loans for business expansions. I cannot pay cash dividends or bonuses. Paying of officers and owners cannot be made unless it's directly related to services that they have performed. So I do have less constraints, but they are still there as well. Because the PPP, no prepayments, it is very specific. I can only use it for these specific things and only for this 8-week period.
That's what I'm saying. Yeah, and that makes sense because we really don't want you to expand your business at this point. We just really want to keep you in business and keep you going. It's what we're really trying to do with these programs. This isn't your new loan program. It really is, from what I've seen.
It's a temporary measure. It is a temporary measure. And really what it's trying to do is, and the reality is the CARES Act, I don't care what anybody says, it's an economic stimulus package, right? Mm-hmm. We knew because of COVID and the businesses that were shutting down, especially the non-essential businesses, that unemployment was going to go up. And so between the Family First Act with regards to the sick leave requirement for those employers under 500, and then with the CARES Act and these pieces, what they were really trying to do was keep people off the unemployment rolls through these types of things. And, for mom and pop businesses, this may work. For farms are just different. And we've been having issues prior to COVID taking into account. And as an industry, due to numerous variables. And so this is just another, I keep saying that it's just another straw on the camel's back. And what straw, is it going to be that collapses that camel? And I think we're getting close for a good many out there. Yeah.
And so any final thoughts on, what you would tell people about these programs? Or
be careful with what you do. Reporting is going to be absolutely intense with these programs. And so if you already have not been very good at keeping books and keeping records, and you're looking to get just a whole bunch of free money in the end, this may not be the program for you. The other thing is you need to really take a look at it. And for some, this is going to help. This is going to be a real small cash infusion for many of our farms, especially on the PPP, especially if it's just me and I don't have any employees or none to really speak of. You're really talking about maximum loan values of just over $20,000. And so, but there is the potential to have it forgiven. And so you need to figure out, can it really be used as intended and within the constraints so that it can be forgiven? And even if a portion isn't, big deal, go around, pay that piece off. It's only 1% interest for a real short period, but you need a plan on that before you just jump in. And I think many farmers also have to look at and go, all right, is me getting this money just essentially extending the circumstances? Is it really going to change anything about what is going on for me, or do I have to make a lot bigger decisions for more long-term situation? Strongly encourage getting a new checkbook if I'm receiving these loans, one for each, and separate everything, make the necessary copies, working with your lenders and working with your tax and legal professionals that have knowledge of these programs. Seek out help going through your local extension services. Most of them have links and other pieces of information out there, and contact who you need to contact and make sure you fully understand what you're getting yourself into.
Oh, that's good. Thank you for coming on today.
I enjoyed it. Happy to do this at any time.
So thank you again for listening. If you have any questions, please use the contact info at the bottom. I put Adam's contact info down there so you can get in touch with him if you have specific questions. Or you can, if you have thoughts on future episodes, tweet me at aglawpaul, email me at lgoering@umd.edu. Thank you again for listening and enjoy the rest of your day.